Okay, so we'll start now. It's my enormous pleasure to welcome Abhishek Bapna. So, something about Abhishek. He's currently the Director of Product Management for Google Research based in India. He was previously heading Facebook app for India and led video ranking and monetization for Facebook. Before Facebook, he led products for India's first unicorn in mobile. In mobile.
In movie. Yeah.
In mobile, yeah. Yeah. His PhD is in operations research from Stanford. I know that because I was his BTech advisor in IIT when, I guess he's still young, but when I was young. So yeah, no, I think it's one of the great pleasures to see your students do so well. So it's really lovely to have him for that reason as well. But as a product head in Google, I'm spending some time there, so we get to have chats. And it's very interesting that, the amount of knowledge he brings to every discussion, the amount of curiosity he shows, and every chat kind of leads to a suggestion as to what can be done in terms of products, the algorithms that we do, the mathematics that we do. So it's always great to engage with him, and I'm very happy to have him as a speaker today.
Thank you. Am I audible? Awesome. So I will start the talk with a quick caveat that there is no scientific result that I'm going to show here today. There is no rigorous math or proof. So after the first few minutes, if it feels too high level or too sort of industry focused, feel free to take off at any point. And is this yeah, okay. So I just wanted to motivate the talk by trying to sort of think of a few examples where as researchers we often come up with some incredible scientific insights, and sometimes we kind of move on and keep doing research. In other cases, people do want to make real world impact from that research. And so that's the broad agenda for this talk, to understand what is that path look like, both personally as a journey for a researcher. I personally was in research and at some point chose to move into product. And I do feel part of that journey is something that many of us go through. The desire to have real world impact from your research needs a certain lens, which is different from what is needed in research, but many of the core superpowers that researchers have are carried over. And beyond that, I think there is a framework that I believe is useful for how to think of product strategy and what successful product strategy looks like. So those are some of the areas that I want to touch upon. But to motivate it, I just want to share a few examples. So let's say you're a researcher working on computer vision techniques applied to satellite imagery, and you have some pretty remarkable breakthroughs. You might be trying to look at imagery, and you have clouds in the monsoons, and there's occlusion. So you might have some really fundamental ways in which you solve these problems so that even despite the clouds or the occlusion, you now have a computer vision model which can, let's say, detect specific artifacts on the earth, let's say fields on in an agricultural landscape. So it's pretty exciting, never been done before, and you feel that this might have wide applicability. Agriculture is a huge domain. So you believe that this is something that is worth taking in some product format out there because this should have real world impact. The instinct is to start with the solution. The instinct is to say, okay, how can I build a product around my computer vision model and take it out and find some customer who might be interested. Maybe a first customer you think of is the government. They're interested in agriculture. They might be trying to solve problems in the space of, let's say, forecasting how much rice we will grow this year. And so you say, okay, let me take this, let me build a tool out of it. I'll then go and sell the tool, and if it's valuable enough, someone will pay for it. And I've seen this story play out many times where kind of the natural instinct of taking your research, wrapping it around a product, then finding someone who you imagine might have use for it is a great place to start. But oftentimes I found it somewhat insufficient because there are multiple ways of looking at the same body of research. And just to share this is a somewhat relevant example because we went through the same process. There were researchers at Google who came up with these really interesting vision models. and their first instinct was to go, let's talk to the government and use this for forecasting. And then we debated this a little bit. We said, like, is this the most effective way for us to have the highest impact from this research? And that is a path that we will follow. But then another thing came out. We said, okay, like, for a minute, let's drop the research that we came up with. Let's wear the persona of a farmer. What are the problems that a farmer really cares about? And independent of computer vision or whatever, we spoke to a bunch of farmers. We found out that there's two things that really matter. One is credit. So they need money to do their thing. And the other is labor. So people are moving away from villages into urban areas, and there is just a shortage of labor. So now there's a strong temptation to take, okay, how do I take my computer vision model and apply it to these problems? And we said, okay, let's still park it for a little bit. Let's play with the problem a little bit more. So we said, okay, in credit, what is interesting? So the interesting fact is that banks have to do a bunch of due diligence before giving out a loan to farmers. There's no history. There's no credit history for farmers. You don't know what was grown where. So we said, okay, is that something we can solve for? If we give banks data on what was grown when and whether the yield was successful or not, we can do more. So we said, okay, let's explore this somewhat more. So we went and spoke to some banks. They said, yes, this would be interesting. And then we were like, what would you do with this? And they were like, we will probably enable some better loan processing systems. We have this massive enterprise system for loan processing. You can build a plugin here. And we were like, Google is not in the business of building a plugin in somebody else's enterprise system. But we have a really interesting financial product called Google Pay. Let's explore whether there's something there. And we went and spoke to the Google Pay team. Turned out that they have an interest in giving credit as the next step from transactions. So we said, okay, what is there something interesting going on here? And so Google Pay to give credit to customers. So this is a slightly long story, but I think it'll just illustrate the point. Where Google Pay to give credit to regular customers, not farmers, takes interesting data that because now you have transaction history, you can go to a bank and say this customer is more credit worthy. You can have that conversation with a bank. And we said, yes, this is interesting, but what if they had to give it to a farmer? Can we do more? And so now if you bring in transaction history along with geospatial insights, it can be way more interesting for a bank. And so now that suddenly changes the whole dimension where we want to explore this. Now, the question is, why should Google care? We're not interested in agricultural loans as a product like portfolio, but we are interested in climate change. Now, a completely different dimension comes along and we say, okay, how can we use this for climate change impact? And then we said, this can be a really powerful vehicle because finance is behavior changing. At scale, if I want to change the behavior of millions of farmers, and farming is a huge contributor to climate emissions. So I don't know if you know, but 10% of methane emissions come from rice paddy flooding. So when farms are flooded, the microbes underneath produce methane. That methane is up in the air, and that causes global warming. So we said, if we can influence behavior at scale through loans, we can then structure things differently so that farmers actually do less flooding of rice fields. And that then becomes the next dimension to say, why would banks behave in a way that they incentivize sustainable farming? And they said, okay, if we're going to give them data, we can ask them to behave differently and give cheaper loans for more sustainable practices. So like what started off as a computer vision problem is now a discussion about sustainable agriculture. And again, this is a thought process. It's not that Google has invested in this as a product or whatever. I'm just talking about the thought process of how a piece of research went into thinking of a product. Another example was in the medical image domain. So Google has done a bunch of work in computer vision for medical imaging, X-rays, CT scans, MRI, so on. Independently happening, great stuff. Like we work with some of the best companies in the world to try and get this out into kind of breast cancer detection or in lung cancer detection, in diabetic retinopathy. There's a bunch of work happening in that area. Separately, there was another team working on the robustness of machine learning. Right? So very deep mathematical ideas on how, and you know them well, Pratik and others, working on how do you make ML models more robust to out of domain shifts. So it's a abstract problem. We know that this problem exists when you take ML models in one domain, apply it to another distribution. They often sort of behave very fragile in a fragile manner, and they don't seem to work. So there were some really interesting results mathematically on what does it take to make them more robust. And we said, okay, let's just write a paper about this and do more. And I said, like, let's hold on. Can we do more with this? Like, what does it mean for this to be robust? Are there interesting human applications to something like this? And then we explored, we spoke to a bunch of folks. We spoke to the medical imaging team, and it turned out that it is a real problem in medical imaging AI, where if you train your models on images coming from a set of X-ray machines, and then you try to deploy them in other hospitals where they might have some other X-ray machines, these things can sometimes have catastrophic failures, and they might detect completely incorrectly. So they work amazingly well when the kind of X-rays that you're showing in test time are related to the training data set, but this robustness breaks down. And we said that that would be a much more powerful way for us to do this. The next question was like, who would care? Like, who do you go talk to implement something like this? Do you go work with a hospital? Do you go work with a so there's so many parties involved in this, that in the healthcare system, especially, where who's paying for it? It could be an insurance company. It could be the people building these devices. It could be the people building the tools for radiologists. So after you go and talk to all of these people, it turns out that companies like Philips and others who might already be building out these imaging systems do really care about these things. There are others. And so when we went and spoke with many of these companies, you then end up with a certain angle of a product attack, which initially might feel enterprisey. We explored like consumer ways in which we could do this. Can we build an app where when people kind of get their data? So the problem we realized was a lot of people, like my dad went through a spine surgery last year. And one of the fundamental problems with radiology data is communication, right? So he got an MRI in Jodhpur. You're now suddenly recommended a spine surgery, and you're frantically looking for a surgeon somewhere in the country. And you want to send this image data to a bunch of places. That problem is unsolved. Like, you still have to go get a CD, send it to someone, then a doctor sometimes can't open the files, and it's a big nightmare. So we said, can we solve the communication problem for medical imaging? So instead of going and working with a medical device company, can we build an app where you can seamlessly share your imaging data with other doctors? In the process, you will digitize the whole pipeline. And if we did that, then we can layer in all of this algorithmic stuff on top of it, because training large amounts of data, like training these models on large amounts of data, is one of the most sort of fundamental ways in which we can make progress. The fastest way to get that data might be through being on the communication path. Like, again, not a strategy that we've played out in actual products, but the thought process took us from working with medical image companies to insurance companies to building a consumer app, and that's kind of the space of exploration. So just a couple of examples to motivate the fact that there's many different ways in which research can be ultimately taken out and externalized in the form of product. And so that's kind of broadly what I wanted to just motivate with. So for the talk, I maybe break this in three parts. One is, in some ways, motivating it internally to say, like, why would you want to take this out to the world? And if you did so, what are some of the superpowers that researchers bring, and what are some of the blind spots that you might have? I'll just kind of breeze through that section. Spend a little more time on product strategy and different elements that I believe are important for good product strategy. And then, kind of given where research comes from, how do you transition into the world of that product strategy? So as researchers, just quickly emphasizing like your superpowers and blind spots, again, not applicable to everyone, but my broad observations. So researchers have broad domain expertise. They're extremely rational, experiment and evidence-based mindset, have strong comfort with abstractions and connecting different fields. And I think the most important thing I feel researchers have is the attribute of asking, like, is this an important thing to work on? And I'm sort of stating these because all of these apply in some form or the other in the product domain as well. Some of the blind spots I've seen are we've often not worked in very large teams. I think especially as we get into more of the theoretical sciences, I think it's traditionally been easier to do stuff in very small teams. Building large products needs a lot of cross-functional large teamwork. I think understanding people's needs. I think that example that I gave of the farmer was like, well, being able to put yourself in the shoes of some layman user need is it seems like an easy thing to do for most people, but oftentimes that is the hardest. And I just wanted to emphasize that. Also, as a product person, it's important to go broad. I think as researchers, we know really well how to go deep, but sort of skimming the surface of a lot of related fields, like in the case of that example, knowing what's happening in insurance, knowing what's happening in credit, knowing what's happening in computer vision, and then somehow being able to tie them in a manner that actually works, because it could break down at so many levels. At least knowing a little bit of all of these areas becomes really important. And I think the last is building a product is part research, but a large part of it is a lot of kind of mundane logistical work that needs to go into making it successful. And generally, researchers tend to distaste that kind of work. So I will come back to this, but I just wanted to kind of lay those out. If you disagree, feel free. But it's meant to be interactive, so at any point, feel free to stop me, ask questions, take it in any direction. This is my assertion on what successful product strategy constitutes. Even within the world of product managers, many people start with the assumption that successful product strategy is rooted in identifying user needs as at the heart of it. So first question everyone asks is, okay, which need is this solving and for whom? If that doesn't solve a need, it's probably not going to be a successful product. But I would emphasize that there's two equally important parts to a successful product beyond the user needs and kind of the functional aspects. One is the craft of the product. So there's various dimensions to why a product is successful, and I think function only scratches the surface, but how it's built and how it appeals to a user is equally important. And the third is context, which is just being at the right time and the right place for your product. So the same thing done in a different era, sometimes it's either too late or it's too early. So let me go through these. I think on unmet user needs, I think the first question I generally tend to ask is this like an aspirin or is this a vitamin? So a lot of people feel that if we build this, wouldn't it be nice? And people would, I believe people would want it. And generally, we kind of overestimate how much people care about our work. And people in general are super busy. They're mostly committed to existing products. They have very little attention for new ideas. So unless it's a burning problem for someone that you're solving, it's unlikely that they will care about it. There are other ways to make them care about it, but the natural instinct that, yes, I have some amazing idea and someone should care about this because it's so amazing, normally doesn't work. The other, so it's behind that thing is it, can you make it complementary to some other need, right? So we sometimes think of needs as things in isolation, right? Like this example, I have some amazing computer vision model. Can I wrap it into a tool? Can I hand it to someone who might want it and they should give me some money because it seems useful? Most successful products ride as sort of adjacent features or complementary need serving things of other products. Right? So if you build things that are already distributed at scale, then making additional improvements to them is much more easier. And while it seems less 0 to 1, like the instinct is, okay, I want to build a startup, I want to make something from scratch and make it big, like this is going to be an amazing new thing in the world. Finding ways to attach it to other well-distributed products is often a pretty important strategy that many people ignore. I think sometimes you're looking too hard for unmet needs, but sometimes needs are met, but they are just met in an expensive manner. And if you can reduce the cost of meeting the same needs, that's a big enough thing. And the last is, when you go out there and you talk to people, you often don't get the right answers on what they really care about. So many times needs are implicit and not explicitly mentioned. Like no matter how much you survey people, what they tell you they need is not what really matters. So building the art of observing latent behavior, I think, is one of I think the real important attributes, where you might see people who are trying to go through hoops to achieve something because they don't have the thing they really need. I often find those to be the best places to identify needs. Right? A good example is when I was at Facebook. Facebook had this product called Facebook Groups, where you have a group of people and they can discuss things. Facebook had no commerce product at that point. Like you could not do transactions on Facebook. Many of you may not know that it still has, but it has one of the most successful commerce products. What we realized was that people were using groups to buy and sell secondhand products. Like there were many buy and sell groups that emerged within the group's product, and they were ignored for a while and nobody seemed to care about it. And then one day, one product manager got up and said, look, there's so much latent behavior. People are trying to bend groups to buy and sell stuff. Should we not just build a secondhand marketplace around this? So we went and did the research on, like, why do they use this for secondhand? Why can't they use eBay, or why can't they use Craigslist in the US? And in India, there's OLX and other players. Turned out that secondhand buying and selling needs a lot of communication with it. Like you need to coordinate where to buy and sell. You need to exchange, negotiate, do a bunch of communication. And most secondhand marketplaces did not have good communication tools. So having a group allowed for discovery, allowed for kind of topical. If you're looking for electronics in a certain area, people had groups for that. So that latent behavior was a much better. Nobody came to us and said, look, Facebook, build a commerce product for us. But observing that implicit behavior really helped us. And today it's one of the most successful secondhand marketplaces in the world. The context is the sort of the time and place. If you've heard of Clubhouse, it was an audio product which was launched about a year and a half, 2 years ago. It was blowing up everywhere. Everyone was raving about it. And because of that, any audio product out there became really successful. 6 months later, nobody seems to care about audio, and it's dead. And there's no investment in it. There is no one who's building audio explicit products. And so knowing what's happening around you is really important. So we could do that. I think the few dimensions to this is, one is there's structural barriers that in any industry, there are successful products which have already instituted barriers for entry. So knowing what you're up against structurally is really important. There's lots of unconscious behaviors and habits. People like don't respond rationally to products. You wake up in the morning, you pull out your phone. Like I'm in the metro sometimes and I just see people's behavior on the phone, and it's like very hard to explain, right? They'll pull it out 16 times, just like do a refresh of their apps page, hoping that some app shows up. I don't know what they're hoping for. And like then they'll put it back in again. Like, and I really have no idea what's going on. But the only way to explain it is that it is a habit that's been built for other reasons that gets carried over in this. But it's important to recognize, like oftentimes as researchers, we expect rational behavior from humans. And that is just not true. Like I think habits and you can try to fight it. You can try to say, no, this is what people should be doing. But it's way more easy, even if you go down that path, highly encouraged to acknowledge the existing habits so that it's not a blind spot, and that you recognize the task that's up against the existing habits. So that's the part I wanted to, like, I'm a huge believer in just observing people's kind of natural habits non-judgmentally, making a note of them and saying, like, this is what they would do if laws of humanity worked somehow. And I think in that context is where you're placing your product. Like you're not doing it in isolation and for some idealized human being. So I think it's important to do that. And I think then the positioning and narrative, this one, I always undervalued this, but how you frame your product, the same product can be seen as a social media product, it can be seen as a communication product, it can be seen as like a tool for buying and selling. And I think this is in the context of the internet products, but anything you build has so many facets. The medical imaging example I gave, it could be a tool for, it could be the best tool for radiologists. And you could position it as, here is a replacement to a radiologist, and you're almost certainly going to be doomed because you will just run up against human incentives that don't want to be replaced. But if you position this as an augmenter and an assistant of radiologist, where you're like, your jobs are safe, this will only help you get a second opinion on your radiology image, like suddenly it's a very different story when you go and have a conversation with a hospital.
Vijay, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
You go around India, the biggest problem for most of the population is that they don't have access to doctors. So our health is injured and they refuse to go to doctors because they can't pay the money for it.
Yeah.
And yet we don't see technology answering that question. What is blocking it? Is it the human angle or no?
So I'm hazarding a guess here, like I'm not the expert in this in public health, but I had spent, like when I was at Facebook, we had done a bunch of work during COVID to understand like what was happening. And there's definitely a kind of the resource constrained environment. There's a finite number of doctors, and I think that's one part to it. I think the access, like how technology can solve this, like telemedicine was opened up during COVID, right? For the first time, you could prescribe medicine on video. And that was a great step by, I think ICMR had taken that step. And that did open up a lot of doors. What we noticed was that a lot of people came up with new tools that would be really well integrated into your telehealth systems to spread like video consultation and access. So it's been a desired state to use telemedicine to get access to all parts of the country for a very long time. And video conferencing is not new. Like I have seen systems from Cisco Polymath systems way back from 15 years ago. But what really changed was the comfort with WhatsApp. So even though a lot of people couldn't, like doctors were struggling with WhatsApp because they were getting these video calls during COVID from people all over the world, people like sitting in their banyan and lungi at home and doing their calls. Like, so there was a lot of discomfort with what was going on, but still it worked in a certain sense, where doctors could reach a large part of the audience because the tool was so ubiquitous and so simple. And I'll come to some parts of simplicity.
No, but doctors are still expensive, their time is expensive. You can have a technology solution which kind of,
like an AI system.
Yeah.
So
why is that not happening? Why would Google not take that up or some company not take that up? There's no, it seems like there may not be easy money to make.
I think, so building an expert, like let's say an expert medical, I would imagine, like, I mean, if I could just play it out, right? Like, let's say you build this as a new tool, right? So you now open a new company, and there's a bot on the other side. I think the first problem will be trust. Like, how do you gain trust? And that's a chicken and egg problem. Like, till you have enough word of mouth of people saying, yes, this thing actually works. Health is super sensitive. Nobody's going to take a chance with an unreputed system. So my general instinct is it has to be augmenting some existing doctor. Like, I think it's hard to have a standalone bot. Like today, you could go to ChatGPT and ask a bunch of health questions. Mostly you would not be sure whether you would actually apply it to your own lives. You might try it out in certain cases, but there is going to be a haze of uncertainty on whether it's good. And I think certain domains are just too sensitive for people to trust a bot yet. So I think, but there will be a path to it. There will be a path where, similar to self-driving cars, where like one approach is to go build a fully autonomous vehicle. The other approach is to improve cruise control by a little bit till you're in a world of self-driving cars and you don't realize it. My sense is in health, you'll have to go down the second path where you still go to a doctor, but then maybe the follow-up communication happening with you is from his automated system, or maybe the kind of, instead of the triage process being done by a nurse, you might have a basic triage system, which is automatable. Or so I think there's a bunch of augmented systems that will first have to be up to that mark, and then you kind of have to surround that core use case of the doctor, which is super um, sensitive to accuracy and trust and reputation. So you can't directly attack that problem. But once people have comfort with saying, okay, my triage is with a bot, my follow-up comes from a bot, my appointment setting is with a bot, my recommendations for which doctors I should see are with a bot. Like at that point, you can potentially take a leap of faith to say for some conditions like maybe dermatology, we now have an app where you can take a picture and it will give you a certain possible set of conditions. You still will be recommended to go to a doctor. But at that point, you've taken a leap into the world of doctors, of like dermatologists. Once you're comfortable with dermatologists, you might find another use case where at least for basic, maybe conditions of flu, etc., you're willing to get some guidance on medicines, which like in my family, regularly, if there's a certain condition, go take a dolo. Like it will be a natural thing for anyone to do. Maybe you're comfortable with the bot recommending if you have fever, take a dolo first, right? And I mean, I'm hazarding a guess here but I think it will be a long haul. Like, so these really sensitive things, it's going to be a long haul. I don't think money will be the issue. I feel that money is directly proportional to how much people value, and people value health a lot. People value expert advice during health conditions a lot. So as long as humans value it, economic models will flow. But I think the path to building that trust is maybe the bottleneck. Yeah.
You mentioned the community of doctors to support this framework or there will be a resistance from them.
So I think, like I said, so I think it depends on how people position it. Like if a startup goes to a doctor and says, this will be a good sort of follow-up bot for your patients. You're today doing so much WhatsApp-based follow-up with your customers, and here are the conditions under which in a constrained environment it can work. Then it becomes a very different story than if the same startup went to the hospital and said, you're spending X amount on doctors. I can help you reduce the cost by replacing 5 doctors with this. Like then doctors will be up in arms in the second case, right? So I think it's a very different way in which how you can have an impact or not if you choose one path or the other. And I've generally seen like the trend, like you're seeing this in creativity, like right now with generative AI, it can generate amazing images now. And so designers, advertising agencies, animation studios, they're all kind of watching this very closely to know what will happen to their regular day jobs. And within that community, you can imagine artists who have been making amazing, like Disney quality artwork for 30 years would have a very strong opinion about whether this will do well or not for the world in general. But at the same time, you will have smaller studios that are extremely cost constrained. And suddenly, if you're making high quality animation at the level of Pixar using 1/20th the cost, that is, the economics will determine how the paradigm will need to shift, right? And I think sometimes that industry change, that's why like disruption will often happen from the bottom. You might have strong structural barriers that have been put in place in the past from existing large incumbents. But then when a big paradigm changes, then smaller entities can make much bigger progress. Any other thoughts, questions? Yeah.
IoT is already playing a good role in smart healthcare. How do you parallel it with the what can generate? What is mostly generate? Whereas smart healthcare is kind of patient specific, doctor specific, and one-to-one.
Right. So I think there's multiple questions in that. Just to repeat the question is IoT is already prevalent in many parts of healthcare, and how would a bot potentially augment it? My sense is it won't be up to technology. Like you'll have multiple technologies used for multiple purposes. I think IoT, at least in one form of it being the source of all of your data being sensed back, right? So if you have like today you go to the hospital, like let's say in cardiology, you go to the hospital, they'll put you on a treadmill, you'll get some ECG and that's it. And there, I mean, the field already is in the where if they feel you need it, they'll give you like this thing hanging from your neck, which is taking a continuous ECG over a period of time. That kind of stuff will move to your watch, where your watch is giving you ECG signals continuously. So I think IoT, in that spirit of it being a sensing agent for health data to flow back, will just keep getting miniaturized and more useful, and more of the medical sensors will keep getting used in your daily life, so that you are much more analyzed on the core dimensions. Now, what you do with that data can be either directly with a human, so a doctor could look at that data and give you advice, or you could couple it with a bot. And but what's interesting is when you let the technology do more than what, like replace a human, you can do a much more. Like for instance, in medical imaging, CT scans are often sliced as 2D scans and then presented to a doctor, because a human can only see 2D versions of it. But the AI system can actually see the volumetric 3D cloud point in a different way, right? So you could actually detect tumors from the 3D clouds directly, or the tomography, like, so you don't need to make 2D projections of it. So in that sense, the combination of an expert medical imaging system with direct IoT signals, I mean, I'm I went from IoT to the medical imaging space, but you can imagine that there's other signals, right? If I'm getting a stream of signals from the watch that can capture multiple things, now a doctor might have a hard time processing 10 days worth of data coming in every few minutes on 6 different signals to really figure out what's going on. But an AI system can do a much better job at finding sort of covariation patterns between these and detecting something else that might not be humanly detectable. Yeah.
A slightly philosophical question. So I can see the directions that the products are flowing into. One is to make things better, or better than what humans can do. And the other is basically replacing humans or letting them do something else, taking care of the mundane things, say a self-driving car. The second has the problem of finally of the economics. If human beings have nothing to do, then they are also not earning. So this is a question I think more and more is becoming relevant, as many of the jobs that typically people do are becoming irrelevant, or maybe in the next 10, 20 years. Does Google as a company think about this and has some vision for how this needs to develop? Self-driving cars are a good example. For in India, suppose everybody has it, there are a bunch of drivers because a lot of people don't know how to drive.
Yeah.
Their livelihoods are shot. Similarly, there will be other things, doctors, as you talked about, etc. So there has to be some kind of a cycle one has to think of. Everybody can sit and watch TV because he won't be having any money to watch the TV. So that's a problem, I think.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, and again, here I represent mostly my own opinions here as opposed to Google's opinions. But what I can say is this is a question that we deeply care about. I think, where is society heading with all of this, and what is the sociological and economic impact of many of these technologies is critical to us. We have teams at Google. We have an SVP of technology and society who reports to Sundar, whose job it is to care about many of these dimensions. And there's many nuances to this problem, but I think at least, so that's kind of where Google stands. We have investments. I think my personal view is that the pace at which the definition of a job will change is going to accelerate, right? So I think if earlier you had to reskill yourself maybe every 10 years and that worked, I think now that pace might change even faster. There will be tools that will allow people to reskill much more frequently, maybe every 2 years. For instance, in coding, many people who did not get into computer science at an early age had a hard time building any career in programming afterwards. I think that will change, right? So many people ask me, like, will software engineering not be relevant anymore? I actually feel it'll be the other way around. There'll be many more software engineers. They may not have to know syntax to do their job, but now my wife, who's turning 40, never coded in her life, biologist, looks at ChatGPT and says, I can do this. Like it's not that hard. And if I have to write in English, get code snippets, what is really now happening is she is now thinking of biology problems and thinking of how I can stitch these pieces of code together, which she doesn't have to understand the syntax of, to build things that she might find interesting. And I think that's progress in some dimensions, and some others might feel that this is a job that used to be interesting that is now no longer there. But I feel that those kinds of things will happen much faster. Like you will have more tools, the tools will get easier. The easier tools will make the lives of the jobs of those who are highly, if there was a one-to map between your job and your tool, then that has to break. And basically you can't be, no matter what your tool was, the tools are evolving, so your job has to evolve. And I think it will be easier to reskill. So I find like at a macro level, again, there's always the inequity problem where access itself is highly skewed, and therefore those who really need the most amount of jobs in society need the access to these tools. And I think we have to solve the access problem. So I think the equity problem aside, broadly, if you average things out, I feel that humans will have a new set of needs. For instance, now with generative media, I mean, I'm hazarding a guess here, but the need for copyright lawyers will increase, right? Because you don't know what was generated and what was copied. Like when an AI model generates an image, is there a copyright violation or not? And it's all a bunch of gray area. So new jobs, or like some kinds of jobs, will increase. And not to say that that's the ideal outcome for lawyers to have more jobs, but I'm on record, but I think that should be fine. But I think we will very quickly adapt to both. The meaning of a job will change. Like even, I guess, so TikTokers who make a living by making short form video, would you call that a job? I mean, it's an experience that pays money and allows them to sustain their lives. They may do it for 3 years and then move on to something else. And we're already in that world. So I think that the notion of a job itself, the pace at which one will reskill, but also the ease at which one reskills will happen. And I feel in general, everyone will have more time to apply creative thought, you know, whether they choose to do it or sit and watch TV is free will, which I will not comment on. Any other thoughts? Right. So the last one I did want to touch upon is craft. I think even in the kind of world of product, many think of craft as the how to build a product, not as a strategy in itself. Maybe with the exception of a few companies like Apple, who have fully bet on craft and design as the premise of, like you won't find this the norm, right? The norm is to say, I have some tech, I want to build a product to serve a need, and then obviously I need to do it well and it should work. But it's not the first thing. It's not that everything else being the same, you can actually win purely on craft. And I think this is especially true in consumer products, but it's increasingly becoming true everywhere. And I think there's at least 4 dimensions of craft that I wanted to highlight, simplicity being one of them. I think this is maybe one of the hardest transitions for researchers to make. Like we start with very complex research, so we assume that we should just expose all of it to the world. Most of the world doesn't care about the complexity. So the art of converting really complex ideas into highly simple interfaces and usable things is in general very hard. Beauty, I think I just wanted to call it out, like people still care about aesthetics a lot, like disproportionately and way more than what anyone imagines. I think having something that looks, feels, touches well, like the size, the shape, the color, the texture, all of these things really matter to people. And to an average person, making a split-second decision about spending $600 on something, that is probably the only thing that they really grok, right? Like you can give them a list of all the features of the latest phone versus all of the others. Most people won't even process it. They're probably just going to look at one watch versus the other and buy something. And most people underestimate the value of beauty. Cohesion. So oftentimes companies start building one thing that works well. It's a relatively small thing, works. People understand what it is. as you grow, you become successful, more things get added, and all of them are kind of disjoint, disparate experiences that don't work well together. So this is maybe a problem that comes in only once you're slightly successful, but it's really important to have very strong investments in platformish things, that like a design platform team that can build components so that everyone is using the same components everywhere. Everyone is talking the same language. You'll often find products where the organization's org chart is reflected in the product, and that's because they don't understand the importance of cohesion. And the last is uniqueness. Like, just, is this novel enough? And people will look up and see something, whether it's novel or not. So like one more double click into simplicity and beauty is like, it has to be minimal, like standard reusable components. I spoke about colors and easy to understand information architecture. So there's a whole science of how you should architect information so people actually understand what's happening within it. Not everything matters. Like, of all of these dimensions I spoke about, not everything matters at the same degree at every point in time of a product life cycle. Initially, when you're just putting something out there, you need to grab attention. It is a busy world with a lot of products. And when you're trying to grab attention, the craft of the product and the context in which you place it is actually sometimes more important than the functional needs that you're satisfying. As you make progress, you grab attention, then you really need to deliver on the promise. So the product supposedly has said it is going to fulfill some needs. At this point, function is probably the only thing that matters. So you really need to deliver on that. If you are successful, many others will enter the field and you will be in a crowded competitive landscape. At this point, again, craft matters. So you have to, without changing function, if you keep improving craft of the product, make it more reliable, make it more simple, make it more cohesive, I think you can still keep that competitive edge. And of course, keep increasing the function as more people come in. And oftentimes you've done all of this, you're kind of successful, but then the whole landscape changes. Right? You don't realize it, you often resist it, but people's attitudes change, people's needs change, behaviors change, the world demands something else. At that point, companies generally find themselves lacking on adaptive skills. Because you've tasted success, it's very hard to leave that path and try something else out. But those are the times when it's really important to rethink the whole, like assess the context of what is happening, pick the next wave that you need to ride, and adapt it with stronger functional needs. All right, so yeah, we have a few minutes. So I think given this, any thoughts on this part? Otherwise, I just wanted to kind of bring it back to the initial sense. So like I said, the instinctive approach is to say you build domain expertise, you then make some scientific breakthroughs. You take those scientific breakthroughs and ask the question, can I identify people whose needs I can solve through this breakthrough? You then build some novel solutions and you try to sell and grow. In this, just wanted to highlight what we've kept at the center of all of this thinking is your deep domain expertise, right? So if you came from a background of solving problems in, let's say, differential privacy, then you're going to start from differential privacy, and that's how you're going to work outwards. But in the process, my assertion is that you have only used one of your superpowers, right? So you had 4 superpowers to begin with, but you've overemphasized the deep domain expertise. And my recommendation is to have an alternate approach where we almost keep the domain expertise to the side, like the first example of the farm example that I gave, and run through the whole thought process of how can I use my rational and scientific mindset and evidence-based approach to really hear people's needs and understand whether the solution will work or not. Make connections between lots of disparate areas and see how, when you see the same problem from multiple points of view, what gives. And be extremely honest to the question of, is this important enough for me to care about? Is this important enough for the user to care about? And throw away everything that doesn't pass that test. Again, very often we're too wedded to our initial ideas, and most of the problem resides because we're unable to throw out stuff. So that open scientific mindset of processing all possible options comes in really handy. And this is just an illustration of that fact that like you start from, and you still start from your domain expertise, but then expand on all of these axes to really get to where you want to. I gave you the example of the satellite imagery. And essentially the expansion can happen in your thought process on any of these dimensions. You could say, okay, I've started with my domain expertise. Now let me go explore people's needs in very different facets. Let me explore kind of the craft aspect of this and see, do I want to over-index on simplicity? Do I want to over-index on cohesion? So when you go down this path, you can end up in a very different world, right? You might suddenly go from building a tool for an enterprise use case to a consumer app for kids. I was having the conversation with Shravan just before this, and he threw a problem at me. He was like, okay, we have the ability to detect space debris. What would you do as a product strategy? And so I said, okay, the instinct is to build a tool which can capture space debris, take it to a sort of satellite launching company, give it to them, ask them for money, and they probably use it to determine how they're going to figure out their launch path. And a completely alternative view could be like maybe 9-year-olds really care about having video games about space debris in real time, and there could be a Pokemon Go equivalent of what you want to do there. Like, don't throw away that idea just yet. Like, let that simmer, let that exploration happen, see how that fits in. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe what that does is gives you a data collection strategy that then makes your accuracy much better, so that when you go to NASA, it works. I mean, I'm just making up stuff, but the idea is be comfortable in that exploration space to try out multiple things and also understand what your bottlenecks for success might be. In the world of AI, data often ends up being a bottleneck. Like I gave you the example of the medical imaging thing. And we know that getting medical imaging data is hard. If you solve the communication problem of medical imaging, like if my dad could send his spine imagery easily to doctors all over India, the data problem becomes a collateral thing. I don't have to go sign contracts with 100 hospitals. I will get it on the pipe, and then AI will do much better. So it's just a different way to think of the whole problem. Where your end goal might not have been to build a consumer app, but the consumer app to communicate data might be the best way to solve radiologists' problems. Yeah, so I'm almost at time. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was, like, while all of this is nice and it feels like a nice framework, in general, the minute you start, things get messy very quickly. The real world comes in. There's real constraints. Lots of things don't fall in a nice structure. But at that point, what I felt is communication. It really helps. So for any strategy, you're going to work with a bunch of people, and the ability to continuously communicate. Like, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to win on one dimension? Let's explore this. Like, if you have a thought process that is rational, that is evidence-based, that has a structure, you can get people around it for a certain period of time, explore it, have a clear, measurable sense of whether you made progress, throw it away if it doesn't work, and find another one that works. So I'd say the only way to do it is to communicate a lot, communicate well, and do it in all forms possible. So with that, I'll pause and take any last questions.
Thanks, Abhishek, for bringing out completely new perspective into what, I mean, namely the kind of product development that the title said. And if I can, say a few words, like, when we used to talk about product development, doesn't matter. Largely those days, it was more of, let us say, hardware pieces, but also it applied equally well to software as well. So you build something which is very efficient, maybe both in terms of resources that you use, cheaper or ergonomically good, and does the function and so on. And the superior product is to be something which stays, the other vanish, in competition. But now, as you kind of grow more into these kind of products, which are, if I can say, more cognitively rich than those products which you kind of all used to it, while all those attributes do continue to kind of stay, but it also brings a whole set of new new kind of requirements. What were actually came out, some of them here. For example, talking, I think, Sudhir was mentioning about, philosophical, sometimes socio-economical, and so on. And more importantly, sometimes is about ethics and what is good, what is bad, what product gives you what kind of, where does it stand in terms of the kind of things that as human beings we cared and so on. So it brought not just the technology into a big context and perspective, but also poses this new kind of aspects, which also means that these companies typically also require a heterogeneous kind of skill set of people working together, making these success stories. So bringing out this into your talk, I know is quite tough, and Abhishek did wonderfully. Okay, I'm sure there may be other comments and questions from the audience. I'll also, meanwhile, have a look at on the Zoom. Yeah,
Yep.
There's a question. Okay.
So all the great products may not lead to great revenue, right? So how does one tackle it? Like recently, I've read that the Chat GPT, causes some problem to revenue model of Google, which is sustained by ads. So how does company sustain that even in some past?
Yeah, I mean, so your first assertion is right. Like great products don't always make great revenue, and if they don't, then it's hard. Like, so I don't think there's. But so one must always be very intentional about your monetization strategy, and when it kicks in, like maybe there is at least in the internet space, you've seen many different strategies play out. Right, people first focus on consumer growth, and you fund it for a significant period of time, and then once you have user habit built, then there are different ways to monetize it. You could do it through subscriptions, you could do it through ad models. And I think there's now maybe at least a good menu of starting options for monetization in this kind of space, right? So whether you do it as a SaaS model in the enterprise world, whether you do it as a like subscription model, as in the case of Amazon, or whether you do it in ad-funded models. I think there's a small set of things that are repeatably used across these kinds of products. That's not to say this is exhaustive or this always works. It's also true that sometimes you need to have multiple models where one funds the other. The other might be better in the long term. Like, I mean, AWS funding Amazon for the longest time from a profitability perspective, till you get to a point where you can dictate economies of scale, and that can drive a different level of monetization. So I think it's probably easier to look, like the things that stick around are the ones that we can analyze, and those probably did well on revenue. I think many of the ones that died probably died because they couldn't succeed on revenue. I don't think if I had one good answer.
So we have to keep in mind, like, while building products, you have this model or something like that.
Yeah, I think one should be cognizant of whether you start working on it on day 1 or on day 500 is a different question, because there are many paths where you don't monetize for a few years, and that can be fine.
Anybody else? Any other questions? Follow? Okay.
Ready to make great products.
Okay. If there are no more questions, let us once again thank Abhishek
Thank you.
for his wonderful talk. And please join for a cup of coffee, West Canteen.
Very nice. Not a lot.
Thank you.
What was the last part? Communication.